Order, please. We'll begin the daily routine presenting and reading petitions. The honourable member for Kings North.
I beg leave to table a petition. The operative clause is that the spelling of Scots Bay, Nova Scotia, should be changed to Scots Bay with 2 T's rather than 1 T, and 48 people have signed it.
Order, please. The honourable member affixes his name to the petition, do you? Petition is tabled. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition from the Glace Bay Business and Professional Association. Petition bears the signatures of approximately 35 people and calls on the provincial government to consider providing monies which could be used possibly for compensation for merchants in light of Glace Bay's revitalization project. And Mr. Speaker, I have affixed my name to the document.
Petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today with mixed emotions. I am saddened to inform the House that Nova Scotia will be soon losing one of its finest public servants to retirement. At the same time, I am pleased to say that while he will be missed, Gordon Gillis, Deputy Minister for the Premier's Office, has chosen this time to retire so that he and his family can enjoy the opportunities that come as their life enters a new stage. It is an opportunity and a break well earned. Mr. Speaker, as you are aware, it is the elected members of this House who receive the lion's share of public attention as we work to fulfill the mandates entrusted to us by the people of Nova Scotia. However, less visible, yet equally important, are the hard-working public servants of our province, dedicated professionals who, far from the glare of the cameras or the spotlights, work hard each and every day to ensure that families in Nova Scotia remain well served by their government. Since 1978, Gordon Gillis has been an outstanding example of the caliber of Nova Scotia's public sector. And since 2000, I have had the good fortune of having his support as our province's senior civil servant. Gordon Gillis entered the public service as a lawyer for the Department of the Attorney General, with assigned responsibility for the then Department of Labour. Since then, he has served in a variety of roles, including Deputy Minister for the Departments of Justice, Intergovernmental Affairs, Labour, Community Services, Treasury and Policy Board, Communications Nova Scotia, and now his second tour of duty as Deputy Minister for the Premier's Office. While modesty would prevent him from saying so himself, Gordon has quite frankly seen it all and has witnessed and participated in many of the most pivotal moments in our province's and nation's history. His wealth of experience, quick mastery of complex issues, and exceptional managerial skills may well prove impossible to replace. Fortunately for the rest of us, however, Gordon set a tremendous standard for those who will follow. And in doing so, he has set an example for the kind of good work, the kind of difference that one person can make in choosing a career in the public service, demonstrating that serving your province continues to be a noble calling. I would ask the House to join me in wishing Gordon, along with his wife Rose and son Gordy, our very best wishes as they begin a new chapter in life. Through you, Mr. Speaker, may I speak to Gordon, who is not in the House with us today, but I'm sure is watching. May I say through you, Mr. Speaker, congratulations, Gordon. Nova Scotians will miss your service and your leadership. You have truly helped make Nova Scotia stronger, prouder, and better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just very briefly, I wanted to join with the Premier and his comments with respect to Mr. Gillis's work. Certainly greatly appreciated all his efforts on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia. And with the indulgence of the Leader of the Liberal Party, I'd like to have Mr. DeVoe, who had an opportunity to work with Mr. Gillis, speak further on it.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I first joined the Department of Labor back in 1993, my boss at the time was Pat Culhane, who was a solicitor for the Department of Labor, and she would speak glowingly of this Gordon Gillis, who at the time was, I don't know which ministry he was at that time, Municipal Affairs, Intergovernmental Affairs. And because when she had started out as a young lawyer in the Department of Labor, Gordon was the solicitor to the Department of Labor at that time. And I had an opportunity to work with him when he came back, when we were working on the Occupational Health and Safety Act. I've had a chance to work with him now since been elected in his role in the Treasury and Policy Board and the Premier's office. And he's always exemplified, in my mind, someone who is above, in many cases, partisan politics, and one who represents what I would call a civil servant who represents the civil service, who fights on behalf of what he thinks is right, not necessarily based on any specific ideology or partisan basis. And you can't ask for more from a senior civil servant. I've always had a lot of respect for Gordon and his work as a civil servant, and I was sad to see that he's retiring after 25 years. He was a constituent of mine. He's now a constituent of the Leader of the Opposition. So I'm sure we'll still see him around in our neighborhoods, but he's a good man. We're going to miss him in the civil service, and I wish him all the best. Thank you.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with mixed emotions that I, too, rise today because Gordon Gillis was not just someone who I've had a professional, with whom I've had a professional association, but he's also a friend of mine. I first got to know Gordon in his first stint as the Deputy Minister of Justice, and then during his second stint as the Deputy Minister of Justice, I got to know him much better. We all know of his work in community services and certainly in the Premier's office. He has been an impeccable public servant, an example to the people of Nova Scotia who want to pursue a career in the public service. I know that we haven't heard the last of him, but for those of us who knew him and worked with him personally, we recognize that he was fair. He continues to be fair. He's certainly good-natured. He's, above all else, modest and focused on the greater good for Nova Scotians. When I first met him, he was conducting a forum for an innovative approach to justice over at the Holiday Inn in Dartmouth. And he has continued to pursue that and many other innovations. And I think that as he moves out into the private sector, I'm sure it won't be to retirement, we can expect to hear more from Gordon, and in particular, more from his special ideas of innovation and his rambling musings from time to time, which are certainly a pleasure to be a part of and to listen to. So I wish he and Rose and the rest of the family all the best on behalf of our caucus. Thank you.
Thank you. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas staff from the Department of Transportation and Public Works routinely leave their homes and assist before, during, and after storms and disasters in Nova Scotia, and whereas department staff left their homes and worked long hours and in difficult conditions during Hurricane 1 and its destructive aftermath, and whereas staff will continue to use their skills and equipment in the coming weeks so as to assist people with tree trimming and road repair in all hurricane-affected areas of the province, especially the counties of Colchester, Pictou, and Halifax. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize and thank the Department of Transportation and Public Works staff for their efforts. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Computers for Schools, Nova Scotia, is celebrating its 10th anniversary, and whereas the program puts 3,000 donated and refurbished computers into Nova Scotia classrooms each year, and last May put its 20,000th computer into a Nova Scotian school. And whereas Computers for Schools, Nova Scotia is a unique partnership combining the strengths of the Department of Education, Industry Canada, and the Alliant Pioneer Volunteers, along with support from organizations such as the Nova Scotia Teachers Union, Nova Scotia School Boards Association, and companies such as CN, Microsoft, and Alliant. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House thank the many individuals, volunteers, organizations, and companies that work together to make Computers for Schools, Nova Scotia, such an overwhelming success. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's fire service has again demonstrated its continuing commitment to community protection by taking on a huge number of tasks in the recovery operation following Hurricane Juan, and whereas the Premier has proclaimed October 5th to 11th to be Fire Prevention Week in Nova Scotia, and whereas the Fire Service of Nova Scotia will again be demonstrating its commitment to public safety by holding hundreds of Fire Prevention Week activities, therefore be it resolved that this House recognizes the continuing work of Nova Scotia's Fire Service and urge all Nova Scotians to learn this year's Fire Prevention Week lesson: when fire strikes, get out and stay out. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the creation of a safe and healthy workplace through safe work practices, appropriate training, and the use of suitable equipment is a responsibility shared between employers and their employees, and whereas Imperial Oil has gone 600,000 hours without a recordable injury at the rebuild of their low-sulfur gas plant in Dartmouth, and whereas the rebuild of this new low-sulfur gasoline facility, the first of its kind for Imperial Oil in Canada, has involved the conscientious work of Imperial staff and various contractors, making this important safety milestone possible. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House commend all those working on Imperial Oil's rebuild and their low-sulfur gas plant in Dartmouth for their excellent safety record of 600,000 hours without a recordable injury. They serve as an outstanding example on how safe work environments can be successfully maintained. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Glace Bay. Sorry. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
He wishes.
For Richmond.
Maybe in another life, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I beg leave to table an act to amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
The Honourable Member for Richmond begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Bill 12, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Establish a Board to Distribute to Charities one half of the profits from the Sydney Casino.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Establish a Board to distribute to charities one half of the profits from the Sydney Casino.
Bill 13, entitled An Act to Establish a Board to distribute to charities one half of the profits from the Sydney Casino.
Order this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I beg leave to table an act to amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
The honourable member for Richmond begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Bill 14, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Order this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice of motion. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you. And if I can beg the indulgence of the Speaker to give a brief introduction before my thank you. In the West Gallery, Mr. Speaker, are representatives from 3 injured workers associations in Nova Scotia. Maybe I'll ask them to stand as I read their names off. Mary Lloyd and Bob Badeau of the Pictou County Injured Workers Association, June Labrador and Wally Peters of the Nova Scotia Provincial Injured Workers Association, and Lockie McLeod and Jimmy Lyle of the Cape Breton Injured Workers Association. They're here in the House today because of a decision of the Supreme Court of Canada last Friday and some of the discussions going around the Dorsey report in the next couple of days, and maybe the House can give them a warm recognition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many injured workers in this province have been denied full benefits as a result of suffering chronic pain and other similar disabilities. Whereas organizations representing injured workers have fought a long battle to ensure all workers injured at work receive the benefits they are entitled to. Whereas on October 3rd, 2003, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the Nova Scotia Workers' Compensation Act's provisions refusing or limiting benefits to workers with chronic pain were unconstitutional. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize the efforts of injured workers organizations in Nova Scotia in fighting to ensure all injured workers obtain the benefits to which they are entitled, and I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Home Builders Association and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers are working to ensure that electricians are being made available for the re-establishment of electricity to individual homes in Nova Scotia, and whereas despite their efforts and even without Hurricane Juan, the number of skilled tradespeople in all fields is declining, as half of all tradespeople are set to retire over the next 10 to 15 years. And whereas industrial trade should be seen as a career opportunity for young people. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House recognize the value of our tradespeople and encourage young Nova Scotians to consider a trade when making decisions about their future. I would ask for waiver.
Question waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. Now, member of Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Friday, October 3rd, 2003, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down as unconstitutional an act of discrimination against people on the basis of their physical disability, the law and regulations that denied workers' compensation for chronic pain. And whereas the Labour Management Consensus in the Dorsey Report recommended action to deal with injustices such as denial of compensation for chronic pain, but the Dorsey Report was sidelined by further consultation. And whereas the harshest aspect of that law was struck down were enacted by a minority government, therefore be it resolved that all parties in this House should be alert to the potential injustice created by legislation and eager to work with injured workers to fairly compensate those who suffer chronic pain without further discrimination. I seek waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotians owe a debt of gratitude to our engineers, architects, contractors, and tradespeople as we reflect upon Hurricane Juan. And whereas the devastation our province experienced to buildings, roads, bridges, and other structures could have been much worse if it was not for the excellent workmanship of these people. And whereas, unfortunately, these people are one segment of the population that are often overlooked for the excellent work they perform day in and day out. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the excellent work that Nova Scotian engineers, architects, contractors, and tradespeople perform every day. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contraminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Wales Scholarship is a $6,000 annual scholarship fund established by the province of Nova Scotia in commemoration of the wedding of the Prince and Princess of Wales and administered by Nova Scotia Nunavut Command of the Royal Canadian Legion. And whereas the Wales Scholarship, awarded to students who have disabilities and are pursuing post-secondary education at Nova Scotia institutions, has been divided amongst 3 Nova Scotia students to apply to their studies this fall. And whereas this year's recipients are Tara Lowe name of Colebrook, who is beginning a Bachelor of Science program at Acadia University, John Paul McInnes of New Waterford, who is beginning the Radio and Television Arts Diploma at King's Tech, and Mary McDonald of Halifax, who now enrolled in the Advanced Diploma in Public Relations program in the Halifax campus of the Nova Scotia Community College. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Tara Lowe name, John Paul McGinnis and Mary McDonald on winning this scholarship and wish them success in their studies and establish their careers. Mr. Speaker, I request for waiver notice.
For waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dr. Lindsay Myers of Beaver Meadow, Antigonish, was a physician who stayed in her home province, specialized in psychiatry to meet pressing health needs, and provided exemplary service to her patients in northern Nova Scotia for more than 25 years. And whereas Lindsay Myers, her husband John Arthur Murphy, and their children Flora, Michael, and Lindsay Alexa were a family who always took their part in the community and offered a welcome to all. And whereas Lindsay Myers passed away on Friday, October 4th, nearly 2 years after being diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, having continued to live with her great strength and beauty of character. Therefore, be it resolved that this House express its deepest condolences to John Arthur, Flora, Michael, and Lindsay Alexa Murphy on the passing of their beloved wife and mother, and to the many people whose lives were touched by Lindsay Myers. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 4th annual CIBC's Run for the Cure campaign against breast cancer was held in Cape Breton yesterday, and whereas 4,002 registered participants either ran, walked, or jogged through downtown Sydney in the morning to raise awareness and support for a disease that inflicts 1 out of every 9 women across the country. And whereas yesterday's event raised over $400,000 by team and individual donations in Cape Breton. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the contribution organizers, participants, and all those involved displayed in the 4th annual CIBC's Run for the Cure campaign. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas cancer has touched the lives of almost every person in Nova Scotia in one way or another, and whereas for the past 23 years, runners have laced up their sneakers to raise money for cancer research through the Terry Fox Run, and whereas the people of Pictou County have taken to heart the motto, "Together Cancer Can Be Beaten," with 4 different communities organizing runs. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House join me in recognizing all the individuals who take part on the challenge every year to run the Terry Fox Run and raise money for cancer research. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin my resolution, I'd like to draw the attention of the House to a longtime member of the House of Assembly who's in our gallery, Mr. Paul McEwen, who's joining us here, I think, to check in and make sure that things are going the way they ought to be going. Welcome,
Mr. McEwen, here today, and we hope he enjoys the proceedings as he has for the last 30-plus years, eh?
Well, I'm sure he's going to enjoy this resolution. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on October 4th, 2003, New Brunswick Liberal leader Sean Graham joined the Liberal leaders in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec in endorsing public auto insurance as the only way to ensure drivers have the lowest and fairest rates. And whereas conservative leaders in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba have also endorsed public auto insurance. And whereas here in Nova Scotia, the Conservative government, with Liberal support, is spending freely to try and ensure that Nova Scotians do not enjoy the lowest and fairest rates, therefore be it resolved that Nova Scotia Liberals and Conservatives should remember that they work for drivers, not the out-of-province private insurers, and heed the growing recognition that low, fair, and stable auto insurance rates are only available through public auto plans that are owned by the drivers themselves. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver and passage without debate.
I hear several noes. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia will host the Tide Cup Under-14 National Soccer Club Championships to be held this October 8th to 13th. And whereas each province will be represented by one boys and one girls team, with most games taking place at the new all-weather artificial turf fields located on Thomas Riddall Drive in the mainland commons of Clayton Park. And whereas with hundreds of players and their families expected to attend this event, it's estimated that the championship will generate over $500,000 to the local economy. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in wishing the organizers the greatest success at the upcoming Tide Cup Under-14 National Soccer Club Championships as they host hundreds of players and their families from across Canada. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Hurricane Juan destroyed sections of the fishing industry along coastal areas of Nova Scotia, and whereas in conjunction with non-effective fishery personnel from western Nova Scotia, namely the counties of Yarmouth and Shelburne, contributions are coming forth in the form of lobster traps, rope, buoys, and etc. Whereas the federal government every year confiscates fishing trap and all kinds of fishing gear from those not wishing to follow the rules. Therefore, be it resolved, MLAs in the House of Assembly commend the initiative now underway while also approving through this resolution consent of a letter to the Federal Minister of Fisheries requesting that he and his department immediately begin donating all seized equipment to ensure a brighter future for the Nova Scotia fishing industry. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Music Industry Association of Nova Scotia, MIANS, Music Awards were held on Sunday, October the 5th at St. Antonio's Hall in Halifax, and whereas receiving a MIANS award indicates recognition by the music community in Nova Scotia of an artist's talents and achievements, and whereas Charlie Acourt, who only released his debut album, Color Me Gone, within the past year, received 4 awards for Male Artist of the Year, Entertainer of the Year, Blues and Jazz Artist of the Year, and Album of the Year. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate Mr. Acourt for his outstanding success and exceptional achievements. And Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on September the 11th, 2003, the Yarmouth Town Council approved a motion requesting the province to increase the home heating fuel rebate from $50 to $100. And whereas during the 2003 election campaign, the Liberals proposed to double the fuel rebate program from $50 to $100 for those eligible for the program, and made the commitment that it would be available every winter, not only during cold winters. And whereas during the same election campaign, both the Tories and the NDP made no commitment of support for this important program that provides assistance to some of our most vulnerable citizens, therefore be resolved that all members of the legislature recognize that it was only the Liberal Party that acknowledged the importance of the low-income fuel assistance program and the support it provides those affected by high home heating costs. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver, please.
Request for waiver. Here, several noes. Notice is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Colchester Regional Hospital Auxiliary will contribute $126,000 in new equipment to the Colchester Regional Hospital in 2003. And whereas each year the Colchester Regional Hospital Auxiliary contributes between $100,000 and $220,000 to the Colchester Regional Hospital for new equipment and for room decorations and refurbishments. And whereas the Colchester Regional Hospital Auxiliary is a powerful example of the contribution volunteers make to the hospital system in Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that this House thank and congratulate the members of the Colchester Regional Hospital Auxiliary for their exemplary volunteerism, which improves patient care in the Colchester Regional Hospital. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. Order, please. The Honourable Member Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 4th Annual Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation CIBC Run for the Cure took place in downtown Sydney yesterday, October 5th. And whereas the annual event raises funds for research into breast cancer, a disease which will affect 1 in 8 women in Atlantic Canada. And whereas folks who ran, walked, and jogged through the streets of Sydney raised a record $405,526. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this legislature congratulate all the participants, those who sponsored them, and all the organizations for a very successful CIBC Run for the Cure to raise monies for breast cancer research. I seek waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas once again the Tory government is showing its ineptitude as more offshore jobs are literally being done offshore, in fact, out of the country. Whereas the latest Tier 2 Sable project will reduce and not increase Nova Scotia content in the offshore. And whereas this is the same Tory government that when in opposition demanded more than they demand of themselves today. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House condemn this Tory government for not ensuring enough Nova Scotia content in our offshore and for their do as I say, not as I do attitude personified in a Premier who has never exercised leadership in the offshore field.
Notice is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bridgewater residents Lisa Wenzel and David Hebb were the big winners at the 19th Annual Windsor West Hands Giant Pumpkin Festival Way-Off, held Saturday morning at Hands County Exhibition Grounds in Windsor. And whereas Lisa's pumpkin was the heaviest, weighing 1,178 pounds, while David had a #1 squash weighing in at 986 pounds, just 4 pounds shy of the present world record. And whereas Lisa's pumpkin was the second heaviest ever grown in Atlantic Canada next to last year's 1,215-pound champion grown by Bridgewater's Ben Hebb, therefore be it resolved, MLAs in the House of Assembly commend the growing techniques of Lisa Wenzel, David and Ben Hebb from Bridgewater as they take their place with some of the elite pumpkin grower kings in the world. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas good forestry husbandry is the future of successful forest woodlot management, and whereas the development of sustainable woodlots has been a goal of visionary and dedicated men and women, and whereas Mr. and Mrs. David Meehan of Centre Rawdon have been named as Woodlot Owners of the Year for the Central District of the province for 2003, therefore be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate the Meehans on their award and for their foresight in realizing the value of sustainable forestry practices to future generations of Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contraminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 5th to October 11th, 2003 is Mental Illness Awareness Week, and whereas this week's theme, Mental Illness and the Family, Resources for Recovery, offers the opportunity to draw to the attention of the community the tapestry of families associated with the recovery of mental illness. And whereas 1 in 5 adult Canadians will suffer a mental disorder in their lives, and almost 20% of children and youth in Canada suffer from a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the legislature acknowledge the importance of Mental Illness Awareness Week and recognize the important role professionals, volunteers, and family members play in their support of those with mental illnesses. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 1st through 7th is Breastfeeding Awareness Week, and whereas breastfeeding has numerous nutritional, physical, developmental, and emotional health benefits for infants, and whereas women at 5 locations across this province are participating in the Quintessence Breastfeeding Challenge on October 4th to celebrate the importance of breastfeeding, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the organizers and participants of this event for helping to raise awareness of the health benefits of breastfeeding. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Halifax Regional Municipality has not kept up with the preventative pruning program while demand for the service has tripled since amalgamation in 1995, and whereas for the past 20 years, road and sidewalk construction in Metro has damaged the root systems of many trees, which makes them vulnerable to extreme winds, and whereas trees as large as 2 meters in diameter could have been trimmed, secured with guy wires, and safely righted at less cost than cutting them up and hauling them to a dump site. Therefore, be it resolved that the Government of Nova Scotia help the Halifax Regional Municipality replant and reinvest in proper services which were cut back due to amalgamation that no one wanted in the first place. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? Here, no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas St. Augustine's Church has recently installed a new stained glass window over their altar, and whereas the new stained glass window depicts the feeding of 5,000, and whereas the parish has been fundraising for this new window for the past 3 years at a cost of over $20,000. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House congratulate the parishioners of St. Augustine's and their church council for the tremendous effort they've made in their new stained glass window becoming a reality. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver and ask for passage without debate.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas grocery store employees worked long hours with few opportunities for a break on Sunday, October 5th, to help people restock fridges or buy another day's food. And whereas many of these store employees have themselves gone without power and water in their own homes. And whereas the number of employees who were able and willing to work permitted a significant number of stores to open despite road and street closures and ongoing travel difficulties. Therefore, be it resolved that this House express its thanks to the grocery store employees and all others who helped ensure that people hit by Hurricane Juan could buy necessary food and supplies on Sunday, October 5th. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in September, Charles Bishop of Kingston was presented with an award from the Atlantic Association of Community Business Development Centres, and whereas Mr. Bishop was recognized for his volunteer work in economic development, and whereas he is a 25-year member of the Lions, 27 years with the Western Kings Rink Board of Directors, and an accountant for 42 years. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Charles Bishop for receiving the award from the Atlantic Association of Community Business Development Centres for his volunteer work in economic development. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Terry Quinlan began her career as a teacher at J.L. Ilsley High School, and whereas in the late summer of 2000 she returned to J.L. Ilsley as vice principal, and whereas Principal Michael Nee announced his retirement last year, and Terry has agreed to take on the assignment of principal at J.L. Ilsley High School, therefore be it resolved this Assembly bid Michael Nee a fond farewell, congratulate Terry Quinlan, and wish her best of luck in the years ahead. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas congratulations goes out to the organizers of a very successful 4-H event held in Lawrencetown, Annapolis County, and whereas the Nova Scotia 4-H Show Hosting Committee, with more than 20 people working for 2 years to make this a reality, have done an outstanding job, and whereas this event marks the 81st anniversary of 4-H programs within our province, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the 4-H organizing whose host the very successful event in Lawrencetown, Annapolis County. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this government, through the volunteer planning process, has information readily available on the assessment issue as a result of 17 community meetings held throughout the province in the spring of 2001. And whereas at that time, municipal officials and individual Nova Scotians made presentations to volunteer planning on the topic of unfair assessment increases. And whereas the time for decisiveness on this important subject of assessments is now, therefore be it resolved that this government bring forth the necessary assessment legislation or call the bill introduced by the NDP for debate immediately.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the fishermen of Digby to Yarmouth came forward to offer assistance in the form of equipment for their colleagues affected greatly by the disaster of Hurricane Juan, and whereas these Digby and Yarmouth area fishermen are understanding that the livelihoods of many fishermen are in trouble due to a substantial loss of fishing equipment and tools, and whereas, as was their kindness back in 1999 to donate equipment to fishermen in need, the workers of Digby to Yarmouth are more than willing to provide support to other fishermen who must now start from scratch. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in commending these fishermen on their generosity and kindness of spirit in offering what is theirs to those in great need. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Supreme Court of Canada has struck down limits on workers' compensation, which are based on the nature of the injury, and whereas the summary of the court's decision states that the differential treatment is discriminatory because it does not correspond to the actual needs and circumstances of the injured workers suffering from chronic pain who are deprived of any individual assessment of their needs and circumstances. Therefore, it be resolved that the Liberals and the Conservatives who imposed unconstitutional limits on workers' compensation should reconsider their plans to arbitrarily limit compensation for auto accident victims because they may again be illegally depriving Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. Here are several noes. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas young people on the north side will be better able to access the job market thanks to a program called Learning for the Independent Living. And whereas this program gets to the heart of youth employability and incorporates partnerships with the community and the employer base. And whereas Learning for Independent Living will provide employment opportunities for about 350 participants, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the federally funded program Learning for Independent Living as an excellent starting point to curbing youth unemployment in the north side area. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Supreme Court of Canada determined on October 3, 2003 that injured workers suffering from chronic pain have a constitutional right to benefits under the Workers' Compensation Act. Whereas the Workers' Advisors Program was established in its current form in the 1990s, providing legal services to injured workers. Whereas the Workers' Advisors Program argued the cases at every level, up to and including the Supreme Court of Canada. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize the efforts of the Nova Scotia Workers' Advisors Program, in particular Chief Workers' Advisor Anne Clark and Ken LeBlanc, for their efforts on behalf of injured workers. And I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas prior to the election, millions of dollars in spending was announced by the government, and whereas all Nova Scotians were assured at the time that this would not put the balanced budget in jeopardy, and whereas, despite warnings of a slower economy nationwide, slowing activity in our offshore, and a recession south of the border, the government is continuing to say it is committed to its pre-election spending. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House urge the government to tell the people when it knew it might not achieve a balanced budget and reveal the full extent of the possible new deficit, including less than expected equalization payments and the impact of Hurricane Juan. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, here no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Music Industry Association of Nova Scotia, MIAN's Music Awards were held on Sunday, October 5th at St. Antonio's Hall in Halifax, and whereas receiving a MIAN's award indicates recognition by the music community in Nova Scotia of an artist or group's talents and achievements, and whereas the hip-hop group Universal Soul, composed of Finley Tolliver, or Fizz, Tracy Williams, or Tactician, David Addy Coyote, Voodoo, and DJ Joe Run were honored with the Urban Artist Award. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate the members of Universal Soul for their accomplishments and wish them continued and increasing success. And Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Craig Smith, nominated for the Canadian Griot Award, which recognizes the contribution of Black Canadians are making in their community. Whereas the Canadian Griot Award honors the talents and hard work and dedication of Black Canadians in 14 different categories, which was held in Edmonton on October the 4th. And whereas with this nomination for the Canadian National Griot Award, Craig Smith was recognized for his outstanding achievement in the area of community services. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of this House congratulate Craig Smith on his nomination for this award, as well as his dedication and drive he brings to his community, and wish him continued success in the area of community services. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many people in the Halifax Regional Municipality continue to go without power, but are being given the runaround by Nova Scotia Power as to when they can expect to be reconnected. And whereas many residents have not been able to actually talk to anyone at Nova Scotia Power, but continue to be cut off, and whereas the people of the Halifax Regional Municipality deserve to be treated in a respectful, truthful, and timely manner. Therefore, be it resolved that the Government of Nova Scotia make Nova Scotia Power accountable to the people of the Halifax Regional Municipality. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, here and no. No's is table. Now, member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be asking for waiver and passage without debate. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Country Living Estates Seniors Complex is now open on the Prospect Road, whereas this important addition to our community helps meet the needs of seniors on the Prospect Road. Whereas this seniors residence is a result of hard work and dedication of Rose Fitzpatrick and Eileen Ross. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate and thank Eileen and Rose and the staff of Country Living Estates with best wishes for much success in the future. I ask for waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, please call the order of business public bills for second reading.
Bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the Attorney General is going to move forward with Bill number 2.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to rise to speak briefly today to Bill number 2, an act to amend Chapter 402 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Retail Business Uniform Closing Day Act, and Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Labor Standards Code. Members will be aware of our intention with respect to Sunday shopping, and I look forward to hearing their proposals for amendment. Let me speak very briefly to the principle of this legislation. We would start with a trial period of the 6 Sundays leading up to Christmas this year, which means Sunday shopping would be available beginning on Sunday, November 16th, between the hours of 1 and 6 p.m. And that, I repeat, if the store owners choose to be open, it's their choice. Mr. Speaker, we also promised to ask Nova Scotians what they feel about Sunday shopping. They will choose. This legislation will allow for a province-wide plebiscite in October of 2004. That plebiscite would be a binding plebiscite. We also want municipalities to be reassured that our government will pick up all of the costs associated with adding the 2 plebiscite questions to the municipal ballot. And we believe the questions that are being put to Nova Scotians are clear. Do Nova Scotians want Sunday shopping? And if they do they want it every Sunday or only the 6 Sundays leading up to Christmas? Mr. Speaker, I know both parties, or all 3 parties in the House, are interested in making sure we have adequate protection for employees and employers. And I note there will be discussion after there was discussion after my bill briefing about the number of hours a person should have off before returning to work. And if there were some concerns about following through, if any investigations are required by the Labor Standards Branch of the Department of Environment and Labor. I look forward to hearing constructive suggestions on any of these points. Our bill does address the issue of worker protection. We are saying that employees who now work in stores that are not allowed to be open on Sundays cannot be forced to work on a Sunday. They cannot be discriminated against in any way, and we believe there are very strong penalties in the legislation for employers who would violate that principle. That having been said, let me reiterate, we want to cooperate with members of all parties in the House to make sure this bill is passed. We're open to your ideas. We'll be working with all members of this House to move this bill through the House in a timely manner so that employers in this province can have an adequate amount of time to plan for Sunday opening. I look forward to moving this bill through the House promptly so that we can begin the public hearings at law amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to be able to join the debate on Bill number 2, an act to amend Chapter 402 of the Revised Statutes of Nova Scotia, the Retail Business Uniform Closing Day Act, and the Labor Standards Code. This is a a very serious piece of legislation, as of course most legislation is as it comes through, but I think this is more serious than most, because what it seeks to do is it seeks to fundamentally change the workplaces of the people of this province. And there should be, to those out there who think that this is kind of a zero-sum game where, you know, some people lose a little, some people gain a little. That's just not the case. Some people are going to lose a lot in this. Some people are going to be asked to give up a day with their family, to give up the time that they would otherwise have spent in charitable endeavors, whether they were coaching hockey or whether they were carrying out work at their local food bank, or whatever it was that they happened to spend their time on that day doing. They're going to be asked to give that up. And I reflect a little on a story I heard about a shop owner in my own constituency who said that in the last trial period, he wasn't crazy about it, but he knew that if his competitors were going to be open, that he had to be open. So he made the commitment to open over the course of the trial period. And he said, you know, Sundays were real busy. I'm very busy on Sunday. But my store was dead on Monday. My store was dead on Monday. So all of the people who I had normally working on Monday, I said, I'm sorry, I have no work for you on Monday. And he said, I would never ask those people to work on Sunday. He said, I'm not going to, just because the government has declared that Sunday's a day open, I'm not going to force those people to come to work on Sunday. But he said, I told them, since I have no work for you on Monday, I'll give you first choice of the hours on Sunday. Well, the result, Mr. Speaker, was pretty obvious. Those people still needed the hours, they still need to feed their families, so they came to work on Sunday. So when you fundamentally alter the workplace in this manner, you are going to have a profound effect on the lives of many people in our communities. And the owner himself said, you know, the other thing about it was I used Sundays to coach hockey, but now I had to give that up because I'm not around. I had to look after my store on Sunday, so I had to look after that. So let's be clear about this. People refer to this as Sunday shopping legislation. It is 7 days a week. It's a 7 days a week work legislation. That's what it is. It's legislation that means that people will work 7 days a week. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why this won't be upheld, and they go in two directions. So I'm going to try and explain some of them. The first is simply this: the bill contains restrictions on the hours. It says they can be open from 1 to 6, but the Sunday shopping legislation and the 7-day work legislation has a long, long history in this country, not just in this province. It dates back into the 19th century, let alone the 20th century. And there has always been an interest by some people to be open on Sunday and an interest by others to see that they are closed on Sunday. And perhaps maybe the best way to do this is to maybe start at the beginning. But there's been numerous pieces of legislation over the years that has tried to regulate trade on Sunday. And in fact, I believe the first legislation in Canada was based on some English statutes. And interestingly enough, of course, this is the root of our common law in this province and in this country is the English common law, and a lot of these things were brought over to this country prior to the British North America Act. They were the governing statutes of the country, but they themselves have their own roots in traditions that were handed down to the English from Roman times. But I noticed that there was one time an act called the Sunday Fairs Act of 1448, and an act for the better observation of the Lord's Day, commonly called Sunday, which was enacted in 1677. So there have always been attempts on behalf of people in our society for different kinds of purposes, to regulate what went on Sunday. And some of it was because it was rooted in religious tradition. You know, what the society brought with them, what those citizens brought with them when they came to this country. But for others, it was a labor issue. And in fact, in some of the early legislation that came along, working people and their representative and trade unions supported the Sunday closing legislation, not because of their adherence to a particular Christian religion or other religion, but because they simply wanted to be able to guarantee a common day of pause for those who worked. And that wasn't always available, Mr. Speaker. So the purpose of Sunday closing legislation goes back a long, long way. Be interested to know that there was an 1897 act called the Act to Prevent the Profanation of the Lord's Day. And it was struck down in 1903 as unconstitutional by the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. And in that decision, the Privy Council declared that treated as a whole, the act was a matter of criminal law.
Order, please. There's too much noise in the chamber to ask gentlemen members to take their conversations outside, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1903, they struck down the 1897 legislation, and they used as a reason for striking down the 1897 legislation the fact that the legislation was, in fact, a criminal law, and therefore was under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government. So at that point in time, they said, look, if you're going to regulate this on Sundays, it's the federal government who's going to do it. And in fact, the federal government did do it. The federal government decided that they would bring in an act called the Lord's Day Act, which they did in 1906. The Lord's Day Act was set up in order to fill what they considered was the void that had been created by the constitutional decision of the Privy Council. The interesting thing about the 1906 Lord's Day Act was, of course, the federal government wanted a way to try and get off the hook as well, because they didn't really want to be wading into this area of jurisdiction, because they knew that there was a conflict or I know the Minister of Justice thinks of it as a conundrum, that there are those people who passionately want Sunday shopping and those people who are passionately against it. And I can only hark back to the piece of film footage that I saw after Moncton had gone through their process and had opened the doors, and there was a reporter who was talking to people who were going into the mall. And he was saying to people as they were going into the mall, are you in favor or are you against Sunday shopping? And about half the people who stopped said, I'm dead set against Sunday shopping. And they said, but you're on your way into the mall. They said, well, sure, if it's available, I'm going to take advantage of it. So this was, even though these people were, very much against it. So there is that kind of conundrum that exists out there, that people understand that they are against something, but if it's there, if it's available, they're going to take advantage of it. So in this country, the federal government waded in 1906. They put in place the Lord's Day Act, and as I said, they wanted to get off the hook too. So what they did is they built in a bunch of exemptions, where they said that that anything that was absolutely necessary for the functioning of their society, and these are not the technical words, but this is the gist of it. Anything that's absolutely necessary can go ahead and operate on Sunday. And they also put in place what were known as opt-out clauses. They said that the provincial governments could legislate further in the business of the Lord's Day Act for services that might be particular to those provinces that they feel ought to fall under that rubric and therefore opt out of the Sunday closing legislation or the Lord's Day legislation, as it were then. And many provinces did. They waded in to exempt further kinds of businesses. Well, All of this came crashing down when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came along, because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms went back and had another look at the Federal Lord's Day Act. And as you people likely remember, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into our law in 1982 with following the unilateral patriation of the Constitution by then Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And the Supreme Court started to look at Sunday closing legislation in the context of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And around about 1985, I think it was, the Federal Lord's Day Act was actually struck down. That did not prevent then the provinces from moving in for a secular reason to start regulating what was going on Sundays, and that's what they did. And I think Ontario was the first jurisdiction to bring in what was called a Uniform Retail Closing Act, and although it was attacked by people using the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it was generally upheld. And the way that happened was the Ontario Act was a clever piece of legislation in that it carried with it something called the Sabbatarian exemption. So they put this little clause in that said, we're going to prove that this is not just based on our religious history, that it's not discriminatory in that way, because anybody who opens or anybody who closes in the 36 or 48 hours before Sunday can open on Sunday. So in other words, if you had a religious day of worship that happened on a Saturday, on a Friday, you could close on that day, and then you would be able to open on Sunday. So the legislation was saved from being struck down by the Supreme Court by what was known as the Sabbatarian exemption. We don't have that in our current legislation, and there have been court cases since that time that have struck down legislation that is very, very, very close to the present act in this province. And I asked at one point in time for the government to send us over a copy of the legal opinion that they had. I was supplied with that. I must say, though, Mr. Speaker, I was I'm not sure how to put this politely. I was less than impressed with the thoroughness of the legal opinion. It didn't seem to show a lot of thought or a lot of research that had gone into it. It didn't address some of the latest, at least the one I had. Maybe the Minister of Justice has a different legal opinion than I had. Mine was on one. It contained about 3 paragraphs on a single 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So it didn't deal with a lot of the cases that have been heard by the Supreme Court later on. But nonetheless, those, in fact, had struck down, I believe, legislation in British Columbia, for example, that was very, very close to the legislation we have. So the problem is this. If you bring in a piece of legislation that doesn't, for example, have the Sabbatarian exemption that saved the Ontario legislation, and you try to control or contain the hours for which you can be open on a Sunday from 1 to 6, don't you just risk having it struck down anyway and having just wide open Sunday shopping on a Sunday anyway? Because the legislation is still going to be subject, be capable of being challenged. And this is not wild speculation. Will somebody come along now afterwards and challenge the legislation? The legislation is already being challenged. There's a case that is before the courts. It's the Sydney hardware case. I think it was set over in June for plea. There was a not guilty plea entered, and it's been set down for trial, and it's going to go to trial on January 4th of next year. So just after this trial period is over, but well before the plebiscite that's going to be held in the following October. So it might be that a judge looking at this legislation in the context of the Sydney hardware case might just strike down the legislation anyway. And I'm not sure where that leaves your plebiscite, because the legislation would be gone. So this is the problem that this legislation faces, and it's not that people aren't saying, can you find a reasonable alternative what happens now? But it's based on a lot of misinformation. For example, the Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia and the Liberal Party were promoting the idea that somehow there was going to be a tremendous increase in retail if you open on Sundays. Well, no, there's no economic model that actually demonstrates that. And when you ask them, well, where did you get your facts and figures from? Well, they say, well, what we did was we just took the retail numbers from 6 days, we divided it in 6, and we added another day. Well, if that's the sum total of your economic model, you're in big trouble, because that is just fantasy. That's not going to cut it. What you have to do is actually look at what's happened in other provinces that have brought in Sunday shopping. I mean, let's look at New Brunswick. Now, we've all seen the newspaper coverage that says that they go to a mall in Moncton and they look at how many Nova Scotia license plates are in the mall in Moncton. Now, if this is their idea of scientific research, Mr. Speaker, it is sorely lacking. Because I can tell you something, I want you to go to Micmac Mall someday and go through their parking lot and find out how many New Brunswick license plates are there. Because I can tell you there's all kinds of them. Because people, Micmac Mall is a regional mall. People come from all over the place to shop in Moncton. Or rather to shop in Micmac Mall in Dartmouth. So they go there not because it's open on Sunday, because it's not, but because of the selection, the service, the business people who are there. So where do you go? Well, you go to Statistics Canada. Go to Statistics Canada and look at whether or not the volume of retail sales in Moncton, or in New Brunswick for that matter, increased after Sunday shopping was brought in. And guess what? It didn't. Not only did it not, it lagged behind the increase in retail sales in the province of Nova Scotia. Considerably behind. So, the idea that there's going to be some kind of an economic boon as a result of Sunday shopping is just, the evidence is very, very thin. And I won't say there's no evidence, because, it's possible that there's evidence out there that we just haven't seen. But I would say at this point, the evidence that has been presented on this matter is extremely, extremely thin. So, we're being asked, and when I pushed people on this and said, really, there is really no economic argument, is there? And people that we met with in that industry said, yeah, you're right. There really is no real economic argument. It's an argument of personal choice. Well, that I can deal with. I understand that. I understand that some people, for whatever reason, would decide that they want to have as a matter of personal choice to be able to shop on Sunday, and I'm okay with that. But don't dress it up as if it's an economic argument, because it doesn't. So far as I know, it just doesn't. It doesn't exist. So there are substantial difficulties that we foresee in this legislation. Now, let's look at, and the minister, I think rightfully said, because this is 7-day-a-week work legislation, that the minister rightfully said that the focus has to be, how do you go about protecting those people who are going to be called upon on those Sundays to work, and those people who, by virtue of their choice, decide they don't want to be open on Sundays, because there's lots of those too. Many of the mall agreements contain within their leases contractual agreements that are made between the lessee and the lessors that say that if the mall is open, those who operate businesses in the mall have to be open. Many of them have those kinds of agreements in them. And I have a friend of mine, my son plays in the baseball team with his son, that he operates a little tailor shop in Micmac Mall. You know, he works hard, he works long hours, and Sunday is the one day that he's off with his family. And he said, for God's sakes, you know, please make sure that I at least get exempted from the lease agreements, and this legislation does that. And I know that prior to this legislation coming forward, we had an opportunity to give our input on this matter. And I must say that in this regard, at least, I am pleased to see that the concerns of those people were taken into account in the drafting of this legislation. Second part is, how do you prevent people who don't want to work on Sundays from not having to work on Sundays? Well, this legislation also attempts to do that, but I think I've already pointed out and illustrated how hard that's going to be with my recollection of the position taken by one of the retailers in my home district of Cole Harbour. I think because you so fundamentally change the workplace that it is virtually impossible to prevent people from having to work on Sundays. And I think that's the unfortunate truth of the matter, and we're working hard, and I think the minister is willing to listen on ways to try and find ways to prevent people from having to work on Sunday. But I have to say that inevitably people will be called upon to give up that time. So how do you go about improving the legislation? Well, I think that the only way that you can improve the lot of those people who work on Sundays is if you improve the lot of all workers who have to work throughout a week. So you need to look at labor standards legislation generally. You need to look at the hours of work. I mean, in many employers nowadays are talking about, 32 or 34-hour work weeks for their employees as being full-time. And if they're paid sufficiently well, I'm sure the working people are very, very happy with that. But at the very least, the 40-hour work week has been recognized as the standard work week in this province and in this country, I would say, since the 1950s, at the very least. Yet our labor standards legislation calls upon people to work for 48 hours before they can see any overtime. And then, under our labor standards legislation, Mr. Speaker, do you know what you're entitled to receive for overtime? You're entitled to receive time and a half. But are you entitled to receive time and a half of your regular wage? No. You're entitled to receive time and a half of minimum wage. That's what you're entitled to receive. So let's suppose, Mr. Speaker, that you were working in a retail establishment and you were making $9 an hour. So you work for 48 hours currently under the labor standards legislation, for which you make $9 an hour. And then on your 49th hour, you're entitled to make time and a half. So lucky you get $9 an hour, the same thing you got when you worked 48 hours, because that's time and a half of minimum wage. So you get no benefit whatsoever. So I think we have to have a look at how we go about altering those kinds of rules in order to make those people who may be called upon to work on Sunday a little better off, but also all working people better off. What about, Mr. Speaker, those people who need compassionate leave? Let's say I have a sick child or a sick parent, or I need to travel in order to look after someone. Am I allowed time off under the Labor Standards Act as it now exists? Well, the answer to that, Mr. Speaker, is no. There's no provision for compassionate leave. I have to depend on the generosity of my employer. Now, there are many, many, many very generous employers who would recognize the fact that I would need time off and would give it to me. But there are those who would not. And if I were to take 3 days or 5 days off, even if I agreed to take it without pay, I might well find myself without employment, because there's no provision under the labor standards legislation to provide me with that protection. The Labor Standards Code has been called the union for those who have no unions. It provides a basic set of minimum standards that employers must live up to. And I think it's incumbent upon us when we are looking at a piece of legislation like this to understand that the work that we do in this legislature has a profound effect on the lives of the people in this province. And in this case, the minimum standards legislation, and let's face it, when we're talking about minimum standards legislation, I see these workforce statistics every now and then, and they talk about the number of people who are on minimum wage, and they draw a very narrow definition where it's just those people who are exactly on minimum wage. But there's a lot of people out there who are making 25 or 50 cents or even $1 more than minimum wage who aren't a heck of a lot better off, Mr. Speaker. So all of these people are affected by what goes into the Labor Standards Code, what goes into the minimum wage legislation. So I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we strengthen those parts of this legislation that deal with the working conditions of those people who are going to be most affected. And I submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that those people are going to be the people who work in retail, those people who primarily work at the lower end of the income scale, many times don't have the benefit of full-time hours. And I remember a conversation that I had with the president of the Chamber of Commerce in Sydney, and I asked him, I said, I understand from the news reports that your organization is in favor of Sunday shopping. And he said, oh yes, firmly in favor of Sunday shopping. And I said, all sectors? He said, well, every sector except the retail sector. The resale sector are completely opposed to it. I mean, I hope the irony is not lost on people. The only people, of course, who are completely opposed are the people who actually have to work on Sunday. So the question, I guess, for us is where is it going to end? Is there going to be, at some point in time, is the government going to decide, well, if the malls are open, is Access Nova Scotia going to be open on Sundays? What other government departments are going to open? Are we going to move fully to the 7-day work week for almost everyone? And I think that's the unfortunate ramification of it. I've said before that I don't believe that at this point there's a piece of legislation that can withstand the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that is presently in place in this province, and that the Retail Closing Act, as it was going to eventually be struck down in any event. So these are part of the challenges that we face as a legislature. It's part of the challenges that we face as legislators. And so my entreaty to the government is to do your best to protect those people who are going to be end up on the jagged edge of this law, those who are going to have to work on those days. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to make those amendments. We're here to work in this situation to ensure that there's the maximum amount of protection for those who need it. So with those words, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for allowing me to speak on this very important bill.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise and speak on this piece of legislation. It's an important piece of legislation, as the Leader of the Opposition said, and I'd like to place it in a broader context than perhaps has been stated up to this point. Before I do, I think it's important that we recognize, as was mentioned earlier today, I believe perhaps by the Leader of the Opposition, the quick and immediate commitment and sacrifice that was made by the workers this past Sunday, yesterday, in responding to the demands that were placed upon them by the people of Nova Scotia in the wake of Hurricane Juan. I think a debt of gratitude is owed to them in all the circumstances. I was interested to see the number of people who responded to the opportunity to have the choice to shop yesterday on Sunday. I'm not sure whether other members had the opportunity to drive around and see what stores were open, but it certainly was impressive to see how many people were enjoying this day of shopping. I'd like to first set this debate in a broader context. The broader context is that simply we can do better. This is a province to which we owe a great deal. Certainly my family can say this. This is a province with great traditions. The traditions go back many generations in my family, hundreds of years in fact. I'm proud to speak of the past that we have in Nova Scotia. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that we can't just cling to the past, that we need to recognize that there are opportunities in the future. And what Nova Scotians are asking of us is that we build a modern, dynamic province, that we live up to our potential. And in order for us to live up to our full potential, we need to recognize the significance of this as a symbol of whether or not we're standing still or whether we're moving forward. Because if we think that the world has changed a great deal over the past 5 years, we only need to wait for the next 5 years to see how much it's going to change once again. And the longer we stand still, the longer we stand fixated on the stuff of the past, the more difficult it's going to be for us to move forward, to embrace the opportunities that we have with new energy, with new ideas, and to realize the full potential that our beautiful province has. The issue I want to talk about today is one of Sunday shopping, but it has broader implications with respect to the economy and the role that the government plays with respect to that economy. It is not, as we have said on several occasions, the role of government to grow the economy. It is instead the responsibility of government to create a positive environment in which the economy will grow. We can create fair and competitive and affordable tax structures. We can do it both personally and corporately. Government must create, for example, a streamlined regulatory process. They need to reduce red tape, but we remain mired on several fronts. Sunday shopping is one of those fronts, Mr. Speaker. It's an issue that continues to cause debate amongst Nova Scotians. It's a sensitive issue, understood. It will continue to be an issue of some sensitivity, not just for the members of this House, but certainly for Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other. Time moves on. We are the only province in North America without some form of Sunday shopping. This isn't just a matter about convenience. This is a matter of choice. Fundamentally, Sunday shopping is a symbol of a larger debate over whether or not we are ready to create a modern Nova Scotia, whether or not we are prepared to provide the leadership, the stewardship that is necessary to build a modern, dynamic province in Nova Scotia. This province is changing. It has been changing for decades. It will continue to change. Our economy and our society needs to change with it. We are evolving, and the provincial government needs to move with it, but on this subject, it clearly lags behind like so many other. This continues to be a matter for which the government looks in the past and not into the future. Sunday shopping should be a question of choice for individuals, not government. And despite the growing consensus resulting from years of constructive debate in this province, Nova Scotians are forced to wait while the government dithers over making a decision with half steps. Now in this legislation, we again find a half step. That is why we believe, Mr. Speaker, that Sunday shopping, properly structured to protect workers and families, will be good for Nova Scotians, and it will be something that the Liberal Party continues to support in this province. Merchants in Amherst and Spring Hill, Mr. Speaker, your home constituency, your hometown, would love to watch their cash registers ring instead of those in places like Moncton and elsewhere every Sunday. The thousands of tourists that visit Nova Scotia every year, a $1 billion-plus industry, certainly would benefit from Sunday shopping. They are bemused and befuddled by our antiquated shopping laws. In fact, according to the Tourism Association, cruise lines and bus tours are now avoiding the province on Sundays. And for busy families, Sunday would offer a welcome opportunity, as it did yesterday, to get groceries, to buy school supplies, and take care of an array of other family deals. Today, every province in Canada has some form of Sunday shopping, except Nova Scotia. We aren't keeping pace. Stripping the emotion out of this argument, this is ultimately about the proper role of government in our economy. The Leader of the Opposition spoke about the figures from Tyans, did not, however, provide his own figures about what kind of an impact this would make. And certainly Tyans has been out there, the tourism industry of Nova Scotia, saying that this would, in fact, create, if Sunday shopping were available, $24 million more in spending by tourists and approximately 300 more full-time jobs. While the overall economic benefit of Sunday shopping is undeniable, it's important to remember that any approach to Sunday shopping reflects the shared values we have as Nova Scotians. We recognize how important it is for families to spend their time together on Sundays. So we applaud the protections that have been put in place by the government with respect, first of all, to ensuring that people are not forced to work on Sundays. Obviously, this is a step in the right direction, but it doesn't go far enough. One of the concerns that I've already raised publicly, and we will be raising more with respect to the Labour Standards Code, is that there should be an opportunity for 36 consecutive hours of rest for every 7-day period for Nova Scotians. Presently, the legislation under the Labour Standards Code provides for 24 consecutive hours of rest. We see this as inadequate in providing the appropriate level of protection for Nova Scotians. What it means potentially is that somebody who finishes work on Saturday at 8 o'clock may be forced to come back to work at 8 o'clock on a Sunday, for example. What is obviously more balanced and more reasonable is for somebody who finishes work at 8 o'clock on a Saturday to be able to wait until 8 o'clock Monday morning before they're required to return to work. Sunday shopping also eliminates discrimination from one business to another. Why should the people in the retail sector be discriminated against, while in Nova Scotia, as it has often been said, you might be able to lose your shirt on a Sunday, but you couldn't go to a store and buy one? I applaud the government for its efforts with respect to shopping center leases and overriding the provisions in virtually all leases that store operators need to be open. This also is a step in the right direction, but baby steps are not required. I won't go through the litany of changes in position that this government has pronounced over the last several years. It has been a zigzaggy road to the one that we find ourselves in today. Clearly, there has only been one party that has provided leadership on this issue, and it has been the Liberal Party. I find it curious, Mr. Speaker, that I stand here speaking on the second piece of legislation. The first one was the insurance one. The second is the Sunday shopping one, and proudly able to say that it has only been the Liberal Party that is able to say that the position we took in the first place is the position that we stand by to this day. And that's the kind of leadership that Nova Scotians are looking for. In late May, we came forward with our position with respect to insurance, and it has not changed. It is the one that works, and it's interesting, it's the one that so many other are beginning to gravitate to. And with respect to Sunday shopping, isn't it interesting to note with respect to Sunday shopping that the other parties, a year and a half after our party came forward with its position, are finally starting to recognize the wisdom of what we put forward, although it's unclear to me what the New Democratic position is after the remarks of the Leader of the Opposition. It appears to be as unclear as ever. It is its inevitable position, which to this day seems to confuse Nova Scotians, and what we want from the New Democrats is a clear statement of whether or not they are indeed in favor of Sunday shopping, because I can say unequivocally that the Liberal Party is in favor of choice for people. It's about moving forward. I think it's interesting to note, however, when given an opportunity during an election campaign, under item 6, under the Tyans headline, when the New Democrats were asked whether or not they were in favor of opening for business, their response was they will introduce in the first session of the newly elected legislature amendments to legislation to protect the workers' right to refuse to work on Sunday and small retailers' right to refuse to open on Sunday. Once this legislative protection is in place, the NDP will introduce the required legislation to permit Sunday retail openings. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is not clear whether or not the NDP is being dragged into this debate or whether they are coming willingly and providing the level of leadership that is required. What we need on this matter is leadership. What Nova Scotians have been looking for is not a default position. They are looking for us to move forward. And with respect to the plebiscite issue, I also would remind the House of the position taken by the New Democrats in answer to the UNSM question: would your government force municipalities to hold a plebiscite on Sunday shopping in conjunction with the 2004 municipal elections? It's a one-word answer, and they said no. So we look forward. We look forward to the New Democrats opposing the plebiscite, as they said they would, and in fact, bringing forward constructive alternatives for Nova Scotians so that we can finally, once and for all, get on with this matter. This is an issue of leadership. It's an area where we have not backed down from the responsibility that goes with leadership. The people of this province expect government to play a lead role in shaping the direction of our province, both economically and socially. If government is to provide the kind of leadership that we're looking for, we will have the results that we deserve. We can't afford to wait. The provincial government should be initiating changes and taking the steps immediately. As I said at the outset, this isn't just a matter of convenience, it's a matter of the proper role of government, and we say with respect to Sunday shopping, once and for all, this can be done, this should be done, and this will be done. Thank you very much.
Order, please, by Member Halifax Needham.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to have an opportunity to stand and speak for a time on Bill number 2 regarding Sunday shopping. Mr. Speaker, this is a matter that I have given a fair amount of attention to. And it is true, over the last few years, I have changed my views with respect to Sunday shopping. There was a time, probably 4 or 5 years ago, Mr. Speaker, when I was dead set against the idea of Sunday shopping. I often take a dim view of those things commercial that intrude into all aspects of life that make other things in our life less important, so that everything is reduced to a commercial transaction, the buying and selling of goods and services, and the increasing marginalization of things that we value in our society that you can't put a price tag on. And so I've often seen the issue of Sunday shopping in that regard. Back in the early 90s, I guess, Mr. Speaker, I lived outside of Canada, and I lived in the United Kingdom for a period of time where they had adopted Sunday shopping legislation on a fairly modest scale in the community that I lived in the United Kingdom. I lived near the rather large city, I guess you would say, of Coventry, and the city center on Sunday was closed, which tended to be the main commercial district. But quite close to the university where I was at, there was a small shopping center, and it was opened. It would open Sunday around 11 o'clock in the morning until about 5, and generally there would be, a fairly steady stream of students, mostly because that was the community that was being served by this particular center. These were very early days for Sunday shopping in the UK. In 3 or 4 years after I was first in the UK, I returned for a 2-week period And during that time, I was quite surprised to see the extent to which Sunday shopping had expanded in the UK, and the fact that now there's pretty well all-day shopping on Sunday, and the kind of controversy or the reluctance that existed in that country at that time when I was first there had seemed to disappear. So, Mr. Speaker, I have in the past few years come to take a differing view on Sunday shopping, probably as much because I'm now working in a situation where I work many Saturdays, and quite often Sunday is the only day I have to do those kinds of housekeeping chores to keep my household going and to enable me to come back here and do the job that I do. So I recognize this issue from the vantage point of the consumer and the person in the household who has to keep that household going, and who has the responsibility of figuring out how to schedule and organize their time. And certainly having access to supermarkets and retail establishments and what have you on Sundays make life easier. And I say to my colleagues, I would be a bit of a hypocrite, I guess, if I oppose Sunday shopping, given that on Sundays you can often find me perhaps at Pete's doing my grocery shopping, or at the Omni store in the north end of Halifax, or what was the Omni store in the north end of Halifax, doing my grocery shopping, because that's the only time often I have to do it. At the same time, I think a lot of young people have certainly, and not only young people, have discovered the internet as a means for shopping. And I know we all probably read letters to the editor, and there was a letter quite recently to the editor that talked about somebody who had given up on shopping locally and was doing all of their shopping on the internet, largely because they want to have access to shopping freely at will whenever they require it. But sometimes, Mr. Speaker, I wonder what the economics of Sunday shopping actually is. You know, here in the metro area, shops are opened until 9:30 at night in the shopping malls, for example. And you can go out to the shopping center on, you know, a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, even Friday nights, Mr. Speaker, and you can find the shops in many of our retail establishments empty. And the personnel in the stores, when you ask them about, you know, have you happened to come in on a particularly quiet night, they will say no, it's like this every night. And so I can remember, Mr. Speaker, when there was debate and some controversy around expanding the retail shopping hours into the evenings in the stores throughout the Halifax Regional Municipality. And I don't know, but my suspicion is that spreading the hours out has resulted not in greater business being done and more transactions occurring for the retailer, but in fact I think the hours that people work have been stretched, and the scheduling of those hours has not been as accommodating as they have been in the past. And so when I think about this issue, and certainly when members of our caucus think about this issue, then we think about what are the implications of this legislation for the economy, for businesses in this sector, particularly the smaller businesses, not the big box stores that are going to, you know, that have the financial margins, Mr. Speaker, to weather the kinds of shifts in the economic situation, but the small retailer tends to be the business person who is most vulnerable to any shifts, and sometimes aren't able to survive that transition period. And certainly going to Sunday shopping, extended hours on Sundays, is going to represent a shift and some transitioning. And what that will mean for smaller retailers, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if anybody has actually done a study of this, but I would be really interested in knowing more about that. And perhaps when some of those associations and groups that represent the small business sector come before us here at Law Amendments, as I suspect they will, perhaps they'll bring that kind of information with them to help a layperson like myself understand what are the economic implications of extending the hours and for whom these extended hours have implications, because I would imagine not everybody will be impacted equally. I worry about the working person in this sector and what the extending of hours into a day that has been traditionally one of their days off that is fixed and they can count on, what that change will imply for those people. And Mr. Speaker, as far as I know, based on research that has been done, the vast majority of people who work in the retail sector are in fact women. I think it's a sector that is female dominated. It's probably a sector where in excess of 80% of the workforce are female. And as we know, Mr. Speaker, many women who work in the retail sector are people who have other responsibilities in their households. They quite often perhaps are mothers.
The honourable member allow for an introduction. The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on introduction.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate this opportunity. In the East Gallery are two wonderful, one resident of Chester St. Margaret's and basically the president of the association. Basically, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joanne Jellick and Hyman Morgan that are involved with Jellick Rapid Testing, and that is an international company living and doing wonderfully well in Chester St. Margaret's, and I think we're all very proud that there's an international. Thank you. It's indeed an international company and being very, very proud of doing international business, as in many parts of Nova Scotia. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you for coming.
Certainly welcome our special guest to the gallery today, and we hope you enjoy the proceedings. The honourable member for Halifax Needham, thank you, and you have the floor.
Not at all, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to also extend a welcome to our guests in the gallery. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, I wonder what the implications of Sunday shopping will be for the people who will be required to work. And I was making note of the fact that the majority of people who work in retail sales are women. It's a segment of our labor market that is female dominated, that probably in excess of 80% of the workforce in the retail sector are in fact women. And many of these women, Mr. Speaker, will have other responsibilities besides their work in the labor market. They will quite often be women with children, many of them young children. And Mr. Speaker, as we know, there are no licensed daycares in this province that provide child care services on Sundays. And Mr. Speaker, this is a concern. This is going to be a matter of great inconvenience for many of these workers. And it's an issue that I would very much like to know what the government, in fact, has in mind when it looks at extending retail business. You know, I was saying to the leader of the opposition as I listened to the leader of the third party talk, I had, as I said, changed my mind. I moved away from being opposed to Sunday shopping, where I was probably 5-6 years ago, to thinking it was a really good idea, because I do it myself and I need to shop quite often on Sundays. But as I listened to the leader of the third party, he practically convinced me that maybe I shouldn't be in support of Sunday shopping, because many of the reasons that he laid out in terms of choice, consumer choice, and in terms of this is going to put us on the cutting edge of a more prosperous society, then I think that, you know, those arguments don't hold any water whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. You know, retail sales is, frankly, in terms of the overall economic performance of your society. You know, the former Economic Council of Canada, before the Tory government disbanded the Economic Council of Canada, they did a very, very large study that came out called Good Jobs, Bad Jobs. And what they pointed to was that the jobs that they call bad jobs, sadly, were in the retail sector. And they called them bad jobs because they were low wage, they were no benefits, there was no training, they were insecure jobs, and very often they had no career path. People had no ability to improve on their skills and their economic circumstances by going into the retail sector. They tended to be dead-end jobs where people made minimum wage or slightly above minimum wage. Now, unless the leader of the third party knows something about that sector that the Economic Council of Canada didn't know when they did that report, then I suspect this is not the sector on which this province is going to reach prosperity, Mr. Speaker. And I think that that is a fallacious argument. It's an argument that is completely unsupported by anybody who knows anything about labor market policy and economic policy in this country. This isn't where you want to focus. This isn't the way that you build a strong economy, by building more and more McJobs, frankly, Mr. Speaker. So I think it's really important that that point needs to be put into this debate. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, it is obvious that Sunday shopping is a development, it is a pattern that is occurring throughout Western industrial democracies. I mean, and it is driven by a much more consumer-oriented society, a more competitive consumer-oriented society. Although I somewhat question at times this idea of competitiveness as well, when we see Walmarts moving into every town and city in our province, and the impact of that, which is the largest